We apologize for good morning. Apologize for the slightly late start. The good news is we have a beautiful new meeting owl. The bad news is we have a couple more steps of registration to go through before we can use it. So it'll be next time. And it took us a little while to figure that out this morning. But thank you, Vince, for heroic efforts to get us back on track. We've got a couple guests today. We have Elena, who's here with us this morning, and we have our guest speaker, Mike Pieciak, who will be introduced in a few minutes. We're going to start off with a Rotary Minute from Chris Stewart.
Yep. So I came unprepared. I'm actually going to do a New York minute. In 1635, the Huron Indians, no. My minute is going to be about the Rotary in the world is in 220 countries. And we have 200,000 less members than the Lions do. And I read about all the stuff that we've been doing. The largest club for Rotary is in Oklahoma City, and Russia has its own Rotary. It's in Moscow. It's English speaking. You can imagine what goes on behind those doors. And I just was reading about how this is the very first service club in the world, Rotary is. And Paul Harris can take credit for that. I didn't know that. And some other facts were Rotary has been, the theme of Rotary is obviously these things right here. Is it the truth? But it's also, it says, if you want to be a Rotarian, you have to be a true Rotarian. You have to commit to the club. And that's what I was told when I joined this club was, if you're going to do this, do it. You know, don't just show up and so on. So that's my minute. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, Chris. And now Sherry will provide our inspiration this morning.
So Chris and I chatted yesterday about briefing up all of the these two things. So that's our goal for today. And as far as being committed, I will be probably at some point because we got a puppy. So doing the inspiration. So today, keeping with that theme, I'm talking about unconditional love. Simply put, is love without strings attached. It's love you offer freely. You don't base it on what someone does for you in return. You simply love them and want nothing more than their happiness. This type of love is shared without judgment and in complete trust. A simple way to describe unconditional love is to say that you love someone no matter what they do or say or eat. What is an example of unconditional love? A perfect example would be how a mother feels with the birth of a child, a newborn child, or a pet. I find myself kind of focused on that this week. Phil was right last week when he predicted that we would go home with a new puppy. There's a few famous quotes that have to do with dogs. We have a cat too, but we're going to focus on the dogs today. The world would be a nicer place if everyone had the ability to love as unconditionally as a dog. That was Dr. Candy Akers, a holistic vet. Another is a dog is the only thing on earth that loves you more than he loves himself. I think those of us that have dogs would probably agree with that. And then you can usually tell that a man or a person is good if they have a dog who loves them. So, and our dog seems to love us. Our older dog, our older Mojo, was our dog that we had, and she seems to really love the puppy. She would not go on a walk yesterday without me taking the puppy. So I think she's adapted. So that's my inspiration, unconditional love.
Thank you, Sherry. All right, just a couple of quick announcements. First off, there is, you may remember that we had a speaker, Pat Gallivan from Camp Tecumseh with us in July. Goodwater Brewery is doing their 5th annual golf tournament to benefit Camp Tecumseh on September 19th. So if there's any golfers here who'd like to put together a team. I have the information here. And then Andy is going to come talk to us about a thank you project for the Williston Police Department to follow up our thank you project for the Williston Fire Department. And then the only other thing I'm going to mention is that next week our meeting will not be here. It will be at the same time, same rough agenda, but we'll be meeting at Williston Place, and I'll send out information so you have an easy time finding it if you don't know where it is.
Thank you, Susan. So our thank you cards for the fire department were delivered to the fire department with 2 thank you gift baskets from Dakin Farms. Our next project is our police department. So I have the names again of 17 or 18 members of the police department, including the chief and staff. So if any of you would like to write a thank you letter to an individual person, I will pass the plate. Please grab a name. I will not be here next week, but please bring your thank you cards. You can leave them with Phil at the front desk. He'll collect them. If you forget them next week, you get a reprieve till the week after. So this is our next project. Thank you. Questions? See me. Phil also has some Rotary. You're welcome to write your own cards on your own thank you stuff, but Phil does have some nice Rotary emblazoned cards. So if you'd like those from Phil, see Phil. I'll start here and we'll send it around. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And now I will turn it over to Jen Kennedy, who's our speaker chair this month, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Susan. Very happy to be able to introduce my state treasurer as our speaker this morning. He is the 31st state treasurer in Vermont, and he was elected a year ago. Mike served 6 years as the commissioner of the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation. You might hear it referred to as DFR, where he was first appointed by Governor Peter Shumlin in 2016, and then reappointed by Governor Phil Scott in 2017. Mike also served as the deputy commissioner of DFR's Securities Division, where he led the division's investigation into the JPEAK EB5 projects. While at DFR, Mike served as president of the North American Securities Administrators Association, a member of the SEC Advisory Committee on Small and Emerging Companies, and a member of the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. The first time I ever spoke to Mike directly, he was at a meeting of that group, and I had called him and left a message on behalf of one of my clients, but I'd never met him. I'd never said his name before, or I don't think I'd ever heard his name. And this strange number came up on my phone, and for some reason, because I didn't get him, I just left the message. I answered it, and this person said, "It might be something." I said, "Who is this?" And he said, "I'm sorry, I don't know anybody by that name." And then he said, "I'm the commissioner." And I'm thinking, oh, my client is never going to know this story. He was out in the West Coast. He was very good about returning calls. Prior to his in the Mergers and Acquisitions Group, gaining experience in commercial transactions, corporate governance, and investments and financing transactions. Mike also previously practiced at Downs Racklin Martin DRM and the Business Law Group. Mike grew up in Brattleboro and graduated cum laude from Union College with a degree in political science. He received a law degree summa cum laude from the University of Miami School of Law, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Miami Law Review. Michael currently resides in Winooski with his partner, Will, and very appropriate for this morning, his English setter, Jetty. Mike.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation and for having me this morning. It's really a pleasure to be with everybody and be able to talk a little bit about our office and a little bit about the Vermont economy, you know, as at least I see it, and also just to talk a little bit, I think, initially about my path to public service and what sort of drove me back home to Vermont and what drove me to the career in government and now in elected office. But, you know, as we heard, I grew up and was born in Brattleboro, and I think that was something that was very impactful for me. I think a lot of folks that grew up in small towns, whether here in Vermont or elsewhere, get that sense of community and that responsibility to each other that's so critical and so important. And I think one of the things that got us through COVID-19 so well, quite frankly, was just Vermont as a community, that we still know each other, we care about each other, we want to help each other, and we want to do what's right, not just for ourselves, but for our community and for individuals. So growing up in Brattleboro certainly gave, that type of experience, wanting to give back to the community. Also sort of influenced the way I think that you go about doing your professional and personal lives, because you see someone in one situation that's your friend, or maybe they're your enemy. And then in another situation, that same person is again either your friend or your enemy. So you got to sort of be careful, who you're upsetting and who you're interacting with, and making sure that you're trying to stay on everybody's good side. And I think again, as a Vermont community, as small as we are, that's a really important lesson to have learned in Brattleboro and to bring forward into professional life. But the real drivers for me for public service were my parents, who were not in public service per se themselves. They didn't work for government. They didn't have an elected office, but both of them in their own unique ways found ways to contribute to the Brattleboro community. My dad is a CPA in Brattleboro, so he has sort of the business background. He got really involved in our community through expanding our golf course from 9 holes to 18 holes, bringing lights to our football field so they could have Friday night games, founding a teen center in Brattleboro that's now the Boys and Girls Club. And I remember asking my dad, particularly about the golf course piece, because he doesn't play golf. I think him and his friends got like last place tournament and an award in Keene last time that they played golf. But I said, you don't even play golf. Why did you spend so much time, committing yourself to this project when you could have been, working on your business or doing other things? And he said that, Brattleboro had given him so much, Brattleboro had given our family so much, that it was the least that he could do to give back to the community in that way. And that is just something that has stuck with me, that, I feel that same way about Brattleboro. I feel that same way about Vermont. I'm sure all of you feel that way about our state and your local communities, that the communities give us so much personally and professionally, that it's sort of our obligation in some ways to find ways to give back the best that we can. So my mom, similarly, when she was pregnant with me 40 years ago, she helped found a soup kitchen in Brattleboro, Bridget's Kitchen, and she still is the director at that soup kitchen through today, which is quite impressive now that she's approaching her late 70s without giving away the specific age. But it's become a lot more challenging in Brattleboro to do that work. We have seen a dramatic increase in the number of people that need those kind of services in the Brattleboro community. When I was a kid with my mom, maybe 30 or 40 people would come and get lunch, and I used to say it was about 100 or 125, but just last night I saw my mom and she said usually it's 150, or sometimes they're giving away meals as well, and it can be as much as 300 meals that they're making a particular day. So that need is just really driven up in Brattleboro, and I think that's the same in so many communities across Vermont. But my mom, in that sort of much more direct, hands-on public service way, really inspired me as well. And she comes much more from a social justice, liberal, Democratic background. My dad, being a business person, comes much more from a fiscal Republican background. So I would say that they used to be able to watch TV in the same room, and that's unfortunately not possible anymore, which is somewhat of a sad commentary. But at least in terms of its impact on me, again, I think that appropriateness of balance is really critical. Understanding both sides, being able to love someone that watches MSNBC and love someone that watches Fox News, and try to understand both of their perspectives, even though I generally watch CNN. So I think that's maybe my, how I come out in the middle. But I do think it's important to, have that kind of perspective. It's so easy to write off, your political opponents, or write off a certain segment of society nowadays, because things have gotten so entrenched and so divisive, and we really need to come back from that, because I think that's one of our, as a country, I feel like that's one of our greatest weaknesses right now, is that inability to come together and be working for our communities and trying to solve problems and help people. In Vermont, I think that we're too small to be, have an ideology. I don't think we can take an ideological approach to issues. I think we just need to figure out how can we best solve problems and help best serve people. And if we stick to that, and I think if the rest of the country stuck to that, we'd be in a much better place. So that was sort of what drove me to come back to Vermont about 10 years ago, to join the Department of Financial Regulation. Really enjoyed the time there at the department. We focused a lot on consumer issues. So we wanted to make sure Vermonters were getting their fair end of the bargain on things like health insurance and auto insurance and banking services and investments and the like. We had a number of, we tried to be fair but aggressive on enforcement, on penalties. I don't think we were too aggressive on any of your clients, hopefully over the years. But we did return millions and millions of dollars to Vermonters in restitution, millions of dollars that we set up in a victim restitution fund. So people that were taken advantage of through bad investments, that they were really actually fraudulent, they could apply and get some of their money back. We set up more stiff penalties for people that took advantage of seniors in scams and frauds. So really, again, a real strong focus on protecting Vermonters and protecting consumers. And then about a year ago, Beth Pierce, asked me to go to dinner with her and said, I'm thinking about not running again. And if I don't run, would you be interested? And I had to think about that for a while. I had always been interested in public service, like I said, but, I had to decide if it was, a leap to elected office, which I think is a much different animal than being an appointed official, particularly in this environment, as I mentioned. But I thought about it and said, I think the treasurer's office a great opportunity to both sort of continue my public service, but it's very similar in some ways to the work I've been doing. It's certainly political, but it's also non-political. It's sort of substantive, focusing on issues of finance and policy and business, some politics as well. And so I jumped at that opportunity and glad that I did. 8 months now in the treasurer's office, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, I just wanted to touch on sort of how we see the Vermont economy at the moment, and what I see as a lot of reason for optimism, and then what I see as our most significant challenge, I guess I would say, as well. But in some ways, being able to identify the challenge so specifically, at least in my mind, also gives me optimism, because we know what we have to do to be able to continue to move Vermont forward. But, just I think from my own personal experience, so I came back to Vermont in 2014. I had the opportunity to stay under Governor Scott. So I like to think that I brought my mom and my dad's experience working for a Democratic and Republican governor and being able to do that in both administrations. But the governor was very good at bringing together his cabinet every week, and still does this. So every Tuesday morning, we would all get together and learn about each other's departments and agencies and problems that they were having. And, as the years went on and we got to about 2019, I kept thinking to myself, boy, like Vermont is having a lot of challenges, and there's demographic issues and these economic issues and workforce issues. And it seems like people don't want to move here or stay here or live here. Like, are we even a sustainable state? Like, should I move somewhere else? It was honestly conversations I'd have with myself after we'd have these meetings. And I wondered, what are the policies that are going to try to reverse that trend? And, what can we do? And it seemed so insolvable in some ways. And then all of a sudden, March of 2020, the pandemic hits. Didn't think too much about the impact long-term of the pandemic. We were just really focused on that day-to-day work of trying to make sure people were safe and we were getting people the right information so they could make good decisions for themselves. But as time went on and we sort of looked back in retrospect, the pandemic was quite a shift for our state, as it was for many other states. And nothing, I don't think, other than something that dramatic really could have shifted, the needle for us. But it was quite clear that people, sort of over this 18-month period of the pandemic really stopped and took stock of their lives, took stock of where they wanted to live, how they wanted to live, what kind of community they wanted. I think they looked to Vermont, both in terms of having good low COVID numbers, but also just the way that it managed the pandemic as a place that, approaches issues with data and rationality and good governance and good community. Same with Northern New England more broadly. And we saw a tremendous amount of people move here, I think initially as an immediate escape from COVID, but then people continued to move here or stay here as they got integrated into Vermont. And that change, that was something that I don't think we could have created a policy that would have made that kind of change that dramatic. One of the important things that the pandemic did was separate that need to live and work in the same geography, right? Now that people can work remotely, now that one part of a couple maybe got a job here in Vermont, and the trailing spouse, as they would always call it, who traditionally would have a hard time finding a job in Vermont, now could continue to work remotely in their previous job. Just made everyone's lives more flexible, and it allowed them to all of a sudden here in Vermont have a world of opportunities available to them. And then you look at the data, which we just did as the rating agencies visited Vermont this summer. And it shows that, people did move to Vermont. The IRS data that is, collected every year shows that over the last 2 years, for 2020 and 2021, those are the two most recent data years, over 6,000 people moved to Vermont. Now, whether 6,000 is the right number or not, I don't know if they got it completely accurate. But if you just look at that 2-year period relative to the entire time that the IRS has collected data, which goes back to 1993, those 2 years are by far the biggest in-migration years that Vermont has ever seen. So just relative to the own data set, we saw a tremendous amount of inbound migration. And then when you dig down on those numbers and say, who were the folks that were immigrating here, migrating here, a really significant number, the numbers like 85% were in this 24 to 44 age band. So this sort of young professional, young family age band, which is exactly the kind of demographic change we wanted to see here in Vermont. And then you look at sort of what their incomes are. You can't necessarily get a sense of their wealth, but what are their incomes? And 77% of those that moved to Vermont were making an income of $100,000 or more. A lot of them making $200,000 or more. So, how does that impact our government and our economy? You just need to look at our tax revenues, and personal income tax is one of our most significant revenue drivers for our state. And before the pandemic, maybe 5 years ago, that number was like 800 million, 850 million. And now for the last couple of years, it's 1.2 billion. So that number has really shot up. Wage inflation across the board probably explains some of that, but certainly a primary driver of that increase, in my opinion, is the people that have moved here to expand our tax base, not just with average median paying jobs, but really high end tech jobs, professional jobs that are earning New York, Boston, San Francisco salaries, but they're earning them here in Vermont. So on the one hand, that's great. I mean, we've had more tax revenue, we have more ability to serve Vermonters, to create important programs. We have the ability to do that without increasing our taxes. It just increased our tax base. But the most significant challenge that presents us is, of course, housing. The availability of housing and the price of housing. And obviously this was an issue we've been dealing with for a while in Vermont. I don't think it was as acute as it is now, as we saw this influx of inbound migration. But generally over the last decade or two, Vermonters, and as have the country, we've been living in smaller and smaller housing, not units, but family units. So where we might have had 3 or 4 people on average living in a home, now it's close to 2 people on average living in a home. So even though we had the same population before the pandemic, we were requiring more housing because intergenerationally we weren't living together. People weren't getting married as much at a younger age, and they were living separately. People were getting divorced for a whole host of reasons. We just needed more housing, even though we had the same population. So that was a real challenge before the pandemic and became even more acute following the pandemic. You know, there is some good news. The Montpelier has responded to that. They passed a bill called S-100, which is a pretty significant, probably the most significant housing reform legislation in the last 50 years, I'd say. It's really going to end up being significant. And it does a couple of things, but I think the most important thing it does is it eliminates single family zoning across Vermont. And Vermont's joining Minnesota, Oregon, countries like New Zealand that have passed single family zoning laws that allow for duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, which is really going to, from the bottom up, create more housing in our state, which is really important and critical. We're also trying to find ways to invest in more housing. Our office at the Treasurer's Office has created a program, or expanded a program, really, a local investment program that allows us to invest some of the state's cash, the money that we're holding on hand, into the Vermont economy. And we identified housing as our #1 economic issue. So in the coming days, actually tomorrow, we're holding a meeting where we're working to approve our first 3 applications that total about $55 million for new housing projects throughout Vermont. So that's, again, really important to make sure we have the regulatory framework correct, but also really important to make sure we continue to bring financial resources to the issue of housing. And one of the things we're trying to do with our money is focus on housing of all kinds. So affordable housing, manufactured homes, senior housing, workforce housing. I think it's really important that we expand the housing stock in appropriate ways and in appropriate places, like Williston has been doing so well for quite some time, so that we can continue to see that inbound migration into Vermont, that continued growth of our tax revenue, that continued ability for those dollars to turn into important services for Vermonters. So we have a lot of reason to be optimistic about our future of our economy and the future, of our state. Just one other thing I wanted to mention before maybe mentioning just a few things about our office relative to the Vermont economy. Something else that we put together for the rating agency visits, which was even surprising to me, and I try to keep a close eye on this, was the amount of investment that's being made in Vermont. So venture capital investment, generally people that are invested in early stage companies, trying to get them to grow and to expand and become, the next dealer.com or, the next big, publicly traded company. That has significantly increased in Vermont, that venture capital investment following the pandemic. I think if anyone's gone down to Hula, at any point, you see that ecosystem that they're building there for entrepreneurs and for founders and for investors. But the data is significant. Last year in 2022, $550 million of VC investment was made in Vermont, which put Vermont in the top 50 sort of metropolitan areas across the country in terms of the total number of investment. And that's not on a per capita basis. That was on a, just a total investment basis, which is pretty significant, $550 million. And then you look at the time since the pandemic, and that number is $1.1 billion. So it wasn't a one-year phenomenon. We've seen this now a couple of years over. Companies like Beta are getting significant investment, obviously, but so are a whole host of other companies as well. And that money is coming from VC firms based in Vermont. That's another thing that's really grown over the last decade, is that there are so many more investment firms that are investing here locally, and they're bringing investment from other places like New York and Boston. And in the past, you'd have a company that would be started here in Vermont, be started by a UVM graduate. They'd get investment from Cambridge or somewhere in Boston. And then within a few months, they'd say, hey, you really should be here, not in Vermont. Like, we need you close by so we can keep an eye on you and help you grow and help you navigate your path forward. And now businesses are able to get capital here in Vermont in a way that they weren't before. So that's really important and really critical. And Vermont actually saw the greatest increase of venture capital investment since the beginning of the pandemic across the entire country as a percentage. So again, another reason to be optimistic about, our demographics, a reason to be optimistic about our economy. I think we just need to solve that issue of housing. So I've been given the couple-minute warning here. I thought maybe you wanted me to. But no, I don't. I would love to open up to questions though, because if folks have questions, I think that's always a much more engaging opportunity. Right here, and then we'll go.
With all of the changes that have happened since COVID hit, it's so impressive to see how Vermont has really become a destination for people and an example for people. And I'm thinking of your two parents and their differences as far as politics go. It's too bad that we can't take the Vermont model and actually expand it across the country, because there's just something about Vermont. People really want to help each other. They want to be part of community, and so they're open to those things. And I think that's one of the biggest disappointments I have nationally.
Yeah.
Too. Nothing's really getting done in Washington except being ridiculous. And I'm very glad that you didn't have a clause to here after what we had with McConnell. Anyway, but it's great to see a young person too come back and really invest in people. Thank you for all these information. Really an eye-opener.
Oh, thank you very much. And just, yeah, just to comment on that. I mean, I think it was the Calvin Coolidge quote, right? That if the rest of the country, runs dry on democracy, I'm paraphrasing, that Vermont would be able to lend it some. And that, I've heard that quote for a long time, and it always seemed kind of nice and theoretical, but it seems very much more practical today. Like, what we still maintain in Vermont is something that the rest of the country can certainly emulate. So I was down in Brattleboro last night with Becca Balint, and everyone says, like, how are you doing down there? Sorry, we sent you. But yeah, it's just so separate from the the vitriol and the spirit down there, just the lack of being able to make progress on things. It must be so frustrating. That's why I do love working in state government here in Vermont, where we can get a call and we can solve a problem in a single day. And that's great.
So thank you for your.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll go here, then here. Thank you.
So I have a reminder question. I'll put a reminder first, I don't want to forget.
Oh, housing. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is wonderful. What you've done is about the state, I think. And it sounds like the expansion of our tax rates is so critical. It's going to continue.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. And this is kind of a dirty word, but do you see any appetite whatsoever for actually reducing taxes?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And just on will the tax revenue continue, right? We have seen a couple of years now of $1.2 billion, and over. It had been growing and then it stopped growing and it's gone down a bit, but still was over 1.2 billion. So significantly up from, if you look big picture from a number of years ago. So, I mean, one thing that I know the governor supports and I would support, at least there's some targeted tax breaks. I mean, Social Security, the tax on Social Security, the tax on military pensions, I think are a couple that are pretty straightforward and pretty make a lot of sense in terms of continuing to attract people to move to Vermont, whether they're in Social Security years or pre-Social Security years, or whether they're leaving the military. I think, talking to the folks in the military, they view it as like an insult to them more so than an actual, hurt to their pocketbook. And we're one of like a handful of states now that has both of those policies. Yeah. So we, so the trends that we're seeing in Vermont, New Hampshire and Maine are seeing those same trends. So we do have to think about how are we competitive in the region from a tax perspective and from other perspectives as well. So, I think those targeted incentive-based tax relief would be appropriate in a number of instances.
Thanks for coming today. As a state, do we have debt, and what's our debt rating?
Yeah, we do have debt. So the state has issued, bonds for a century or so. And our rating is AA plus. So we just got re-rated. So that's the across the board AA plus, so one below AAA. We have had a process over the last 10 years, or we have had a commitment, I should say, of slowly reducing our overall debt burden. Right now, the overall debt that's outstanding for Vermont is like 550 million. It's in that ballpark. And it means we pay about 70 million a year in debt service. But that number is continuing to go down because every year Vermont has been issuing less debt. So as we issue less debt, the bonds from 20 years ago are coming off the books and it's slowly going down. The other thing that Treasurer Pierce, my predecessor, implemented, and I think it's critical that we did this, and I'm a supporter of it, is the cash fund, which basically means instead of issuing debt, you actually have a fund with cash. And for some projects, you pay dollars instead of go out in bonds. So you save that interest cost. And that's important because as we issue less and less debt, it doesn't mean that we're investing less and less in Vermont. It just means we're using less debt to do it, that we're using this combination of cash and bonding capacity. So when the rating agencies looked at us and said, you're AA plus, they said, if you continue to basically fully fund your pensions and have improvement on that, if you continue to reduce your overall debt load, and you continue to see improvement in your demographics, then you're sort of, the way I read their reports is you're on your road back to AAA. So I think those are the three things that they look most closely at.
I was thinking kind of along the lines of what Jude was saying over there about we kind of think of Vermont as being, we all think Vermont does a lot of things right and like the way that it does it. And do you interact with treasurers from other states and give them ideas, learn from their ideas, and can you speak to some of that? And
yeah,
maybe the country can get some good ideas from us.
So I've always, even when I was at DFR, really valued the opportunity to talk to other insurance commissioners because they might be doing things in their local communities that we could take advantage of. And same with the treasurers. I'll say just two things in the treasurers. One, we certainly benefit from seeing what other treasurers' offices are doing. There's a handful of states that passed a retirement security bill in their states, and we took advantage of that in Vermont. It's called Vermont Saves. It's a program that allows businesses that don't have a retirement plan to participate in Vermont Saves, and their employees will automatically be put into the plan unless they opt out. And then they will have a 5% return or 5% investment put aside for them for retirement in each of their paychecks. It's not competing against the private sector, as you talked about with Jen. It's just an opportunity for universal access to retirement. And that was an idea that came from another state that we implemented here in Vermont. So when we have ideas, we share them freely with other state treasurers. But the thing that is actually a little bit sad is I've only gone to one of those meetings. It was in DC. And at the NAIC, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, every single state would show up. There was only probably 30 treasurers there. And a lot of the treasurers from more partisan states were the ones that didn't show up. Even though this is a nonpartisan organization, they viewed it as being partisan for whatever reason. So that's disappointing, that we can't even get together. But, that being said, we still do, those that do show up, we still definitely learn from each other. Andy?
I should know the answer, but how does your office interact with the state auditor? And as a layperson, I kind of see the auditor come up to be, well, there's money or there's something wrong. And I assume in some cases that money came through your office, or of it. Do you work together on projects, or what's the nature of that?
Yeah. So the auditor, there's 6 statewide constitutional officers in Vermont: the treasurer, the auditor, secretary of state, governor, lieutenant governor, and then attorney general. And we're all independent and work separately. There are times when, we could potentially find opportunity to collaborate. But generally the auditor has been really looking at sort of programmatic audits more recently. So they're looking in the administration, at the Department of Transportation or the Department of Children and Families. And those are, we might money might flow through our office, but they're in charge of their programs and operating their programs. So we really usually have to try to find opportunity to work together. It usually doesn't come naturally just by the duties of our offices. So they're looking, at programmatic audits, how things can be improved. We're usually executing on the financial transactions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
very
thank
much.
you.
Mike? And he's gonna do the honors here in the drawing.
Don't hold it against me, everyone else.
Yeah, I didn't intend to buy tickets this morning, so I hope.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Oh, wow.
But don't draw mine
All
today.
right, the last 3 digits.
Last 3 digits are 570.
Ah, there
Nice.
you go.
I just look at my tickets, all right? Thank
And
you.
I should have mentioned earlier, if you didn't watch Mike during the campaign season and all that, he's the person we saw 2 or 3 times a week during COVID with all the charts and the graphs of what was going on. He did all that.
For the,
Oh,
thank
I'm sorry. Yes. Mike,
Yes.
and thanks for you being here, and we really do appreciate it. Our club makes a contribution to the Williston School Mentoring Program. in
Oh,
your
very
area,
nice.
So
Very
thank
nice.
you.
Thank you so much for
Thank
that.
you, Charlie.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, time for our Sergeant at Arms, but in the meantime, did someone leave this